Greetings! This is the seventh day of unleavened bread, as well as the seventh day of the week when I'm recording this message. It's 3rd of April of 2021 as I'm recording this message. So, Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. You know, at this time of year, people like to tell the story of the typographical mistake that was in a newspaper. There was an article. Ecumenical Easter service. There'll be a minister, a priest, and a rabbit. People enjoy that story. I am in a positive mood today as we complete this festival, this 7-day festival of unleavened bread, preceded, of course, by the very important Remembrance Night, the night of, some call the Lord's Supper, Communion, Eucharist, or the New Testament Passover, where we substitute for the sacrifice of the lamb, the ritual, the ceremony of having unleavened bread and wine. This was in place of what would have been in ancient times a literal sacrifice of a lamb. Then comes the festival itself of a holy day, and then intervening days, and then this final holy day. So this is the completion of the festival, and we have been unleavened for a week. So this pictures, in effect, a final push, as it were. This is the final triumph over sin. We have had 7 days of metaphorically being righteous. Hopefully we've been generally righteous, literally too, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 5. But this is, in effect, metaphorically, a time of triumph. We are about to complete these 7 days of unleavened bread. And there are many ways in which this day is a day that pictures triumph. And I want to talk about this as a day when we can discuss victories. Discussing victories, I'll call this. Or let's say speaking of victories, sounds better. Speaking of victories. Let's go to Romans, the 8th chapter, and verse 37. Life has its problems. The church has gone through difficulties, of course, over the centuries. And yet Paul writes in Romans 8:37, yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Through Jesus Christ, we are ultimately triumphant. And I wasn't going to read this, but I'm moved to read it in 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, in the 7th verse. Paul nears the end of his life, and he says, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. On that day. Which I'll talk more about later. And not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Which is the rest of us, we hope. I hope. So this is in many ways a day of triumph, and I want to get into that. But I want to talk first about a prophecy of triumph that we find in the book of Revelation 18 about the fall of the final Babylon. And it's, of course, foreshadowed by the fall of ancient Babylon, which Jeremiah prophesied about. And when Jeremiah did it, he used a code, and I think it's in Romans, and it's in Acts 17, where we find mention of that. Verse 6. I want to go to Acts 17 and verse 6. How Christianity was described when it was at first a sect, a Jewish sect. Acts 17:6. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren of the rulers of the city, crying out. They were looking for the apostles, evidently, and so they instead, Paul and Silas, the apostle Paul and Silas, they were looking for them, but they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, those who have turned the world upside down have come here too. So from the point of view of the world, Christianity is a revolutionary belief and practice. We are turning the world upside down, but actually, we are turning the world right side up. The world right now is upside down. It's mixed up and it's in a mess. And we're going to sort it out, ultimately. Jesus Christ and the resurrected saints will sort it out. But from the world's point of view, we're turning the world upside down. So what happened was, therefore, Jeremiah, in the writing about the fall of Babylon, uses a code in his writing, a cryptogram in his writing. And you find it in Jeremiah 25 and verse 26 is one place you'll find it. Jeremiah 25 and verse 26. And then you'll also find it in Jeremiah 51 and the first verse of that chapter. Jeremiah 51 and verse 1. And you'll find it again around in verse 41, I believe, of that chapter. 51:41. Okay, so I won't go into it today, but I just want to let you know, if you look at those verses and study into them, you'll find that Jeremiah is using a code. And here is the way the code works. And you've probably, some of you have heard me talk about this before, but let's say that I'm telling you that I'm taking my family to the all. A-L-L. I'm taking my family to the all. And you're saying, what? What do you mean you're taking your family to the all? Well, I'm using a code. And in that code, A equals Z, okay? And B would equal Y. In other words, I'm working backwards from the alphabet. So when I say I'm taking my family to the all, if you go the other direction, if the first letter is equal to the 26th letter, etc., I'm actually taking him to the zoo. In other words, count backwards. Count backwards, Z being number 1, and then the 12th letter would be O, and on the other end it would be L, so I'm taking him to the zoo, but the code for that is the all. I'm taking him to the all. Follow what I'm doing? In other words, I'm going, first letter equals the 26th letter, and then I start counting backwards. So zoo becomes all in code. Are everybody following that? And that is called Atbash, because Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, equals Tav. Bet, the second letter of the alphabet, equals Shin, and so on. So Gimel would equal Resh. Okay, that's called Atbash. And if you don't like it, don't blame me. Blame Jeremiah, because he used that code in those passages that I cited. But that code can be used in a very wonderful way regarding the calendar. As you know, the Jews have preserved a calendar. So, when we read the Bible, there are dates given, months given. And so along with the scriptures, a calendar is required. And so the Jews have preserved the scriptures and the calendar that goes with it. And so I call it the sacred calendar. And the Hebrew calendar, the Jewish calendar, if you can actually make use of this Atbash in order to predict what days of the week the various festivals are going to occur. And so it can be handy if you don't have anything in front of you. You don't have your device. You don't have a calendar in front of you. If you just remember one fact, you can build. And I want to go to Psalm 119, because there you actually have the Hebrew alphabet out there for you. You have an acrostic psalm. It's organized alphabetically. So you have the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and 8 verses per letter going from Aleph to Tav. So you have the alphabet before you. So let's go this way. I'm in Psalm 119. Let's go to the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So you go to verse 41 in your Bible, and that's the letter Vav. Now, each of the letters in Hebrew is also a number. So Vav is also the number 6. All right? So let's now go to the other end of the alphabet. All right? Let's go to verse 169, and there you have a Tav. Now let's count 6. Tav, Shin, Resh, Kuf or Kof, just pronounced 2 different ways. Kuf or Kof, Sadi, Pei. So now the 6th letter counted the other way is Pei. Are you with me? Now, when the festival of Purim comes around, if Jews who are celebrating that festival, if they remember what day of the week, of course it is, then they can project the rest of the year when everything is going to happen. Because the 6th day of unleavened bread equals Pei, right? Vav equals Pei. It's Atbash. So the 6th day of unleavened bread is the same day as Purim. Now this year Purim came out on a Friday, and yesterday, Friday, was the 6th day of unleavened bread. Now once you know that, there's a lot of other things you can know. But I know what you're telling me. You're telling me, well, people who aren't Jewish don't celebrate Purim. All right, so let's start with the festival of unleavened bread and go from there. And the festival of unleavened bread begins, let's go to the 3rd day of unleavened bread, and that would be Gimel. But now let's count backwards. Remember, this is Atbash. We're counting backwards. So let's go to Psalm 119, Tav, Shin, Resh. So if you go to verse 153, that's the 3rd letter counting backwards, Resh. And Resh is the first word of Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. In this case, referring to the head of the civil year. This is what Jews commonly call the Festival of Trumpets, because it is the beginning of the civil year. So Rosh Hashanah will always begin on the same day of the week as the 3rd day of unleavened bread. So this year, we're in the middle of the days of unleavened bread, so we don't have to rack our brain. This first day was a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So the 3rd day of unleavened bread is a Tuesday. So now without even having to look it up, you can know that the Festival of Trumpets will be on a Tuesday this year. Once you know that the first day, the Festival of Tabernacles, will be on a Tuesday, and then you know that the 8th day of Sacred Assembly will be on a Tuesday. And since the Festival of Trumpets is going to be Tuesday, then of course Thursday will be, a Day of Atonement will come out on the Thursday. And that also works with Atbash too, because if you go to Pei, then go 2 other letters, and go 2 other letters from Pei. So we have Pei, and then we have you have to go back one, because what's going to happen is the 5th day of unleavened bread is going to be the letter Hey, from counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But now let's count backwards. And if we count backwards, we go Tav, Shin, Resh, that's 3, Kuf, Sadi. So Sadi is counting backwards, the 5th letter. You with me? And that 5th letter equals the letter Sadi, which is Tzom, the first word of the word for fast. And so the fast, as you know from Acts 27, the fast, of course, in the Bible commanded of God's people is the Day of Atonement. And so the Day of Atonement will always be on the same day as the 5th day of unleavened bread. And this year, the Festival of Unleavened Bread began on a Sunday. And so the 5th day of unleavened bread was a Thursday. And indeed, the Day of Atonement will come out on a Thursday. So that's another way to figure it. So it's interesting. Once you start keeping the Festival of Unleavened Bread, you can just project forward. Every year it works, and you don't have to worry about using a device or you're looking at a calendar. It just works. So let's review. The day of the week, which is the 3rd day of unleavened bread, will always be the same day as the Festival of Trumpets and the first day, the Festival of Tabernacles, and the 8th day of Sacred Assembly. And then, of course, from there you can figure out atonement, even if you don't go through any of the other calculations that I just talked about. So I hope that's helpful to you and entertaining to some degree. So that ties in with this season of the year. And now that we're in the 7th day of unleavened bread, as I said, we're completing a week of symbolically being desinned, as it were. Having leaven put out, so a week of righteousness, you could say. And the seventh day of unleavened bread is a holy day. So we're finishing this festival very much on an upbeat as when we started. And that's a lesson. In other words, we get very enthusiastic when we first become a part of God's church. And as we come towards the end of our lives, in effect, we should finish very enthusiastically, as Paul, with great confidence. You saw what I read. He knew that as he came to the end of his life, a crown was waiting for him. Now, the seventh day of unleavened bread traditionally is the time of the crossing of the Red Sea, and traditionally the time of the fall of Jericho. So it all ties in with our triumph, the triumph of righteousness, of good over evil, the triumph of life over death. I want to go to the book of Joshua, and perhaps it was on the seventh day of unleavened bread, and we come to the time to when they have been going around the city 7 times in verse 16. All right, Joshua 6:16. The priests and the others have not on that day go around the city 7 times, and blowing of the trumpets. Verse 16. And the 7th time it happened, when the priests blew the trumpets, that Joshua said to the people, "Shout!" And that's very similar to the English word hooray. "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." And the walls, and the walls came tumbling down, right? As we were singing that song this morning at the flare service. I would recommend that you watch the flare service. And we were singing that song about Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. And let's go now to the triumphal crossing of the Red Sea, this final, in effect, end of sin. 1 Corinthians 10 talks of that crossing as a baptism. And when they came out on the other side, then the Egyptian army was totally drowned. So sin is totally vanquished, you could say, symbolically. And so now that's all behind them, and they start out on what we would call our Christian walk, walking through the wilderness spiritually, but yet with God guiding us to the promised land from a spiritual point of view. I hope you're with me on that. So when you go to 1 Corinthians 15, to Exodus 15, before I even go there, I actually want to go to the book of Leviticus and speaking a little bit more about this day and its significance. And it'll tie in with what I want to do in Exodus later. But I want to go to Leviticus 23. We have the sacrifice of the Lamb, and Jesus Christ, his sacrifice was the greatest of sacrifices you can imagine. It supersedes all sacrifices, and it was sufficient to justify all human beings before God. And the Passover sacrifice pictured that. But then we have, during the days of unleavened bread, on the unleavened Sunday, it's got to be on the first day of the week, within those days of unleavened bread, because the first Leviticus 23 speaks of the Sabbath, and then it speaks of the 14th day of the first month, the time of the killing of the lamb. So we have the Sabbath defined, and then we have the Passover day defined. Then the next thing we see is that during the festival of unleavened bread, on the morrow after the Sabbath, we offer the wave sheaf. So the morrow after the Sabbath would be a Sunday, and would have to be an unleavened Sunday, because it's offered during the Feast of Unleavened Bread as a parallel to the first fruits that were offered on the next festival, the Festival of Weeks, or Pentecost. So there's a special offering for the Festival of Unleavened Bread, and there's a parallel offering for the Festival of Pentecost. Now, the first fruits of the barley harvest are what are offered during this festival. And this year, the Passover would have been killed on a Sabbath, just like we circumcise on the Sabbath or in those days, it would have been done on the Sabbath. And if that's the 8th day, and those who practice it today, I was years ago as a young man, I attended a Brit Milah, a circumcision ceremony on a Sabbath in Laurelton, Queens. And by the way, I had a nice chat with a rabbi named Meir Kahana at that time, and some of you may have heard of him. He became much more famous later. But anyway, just as circumcision is done on the Sabbath, so is the Passover sacrifice done on the Sabbath. So the next day would have been the time of the offering of the wave sheaf. And so at that time, you would begin counting towards Pentecost. So that's why this is today the 7th day, counting towards Pentecost. And so you see that the first fruit of the barley harvest, which is an omer, is actually waved. If you read about it, I'm in verse 11 of Leviticus 23. He shall wave the sheaf before the Eternal to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Now, if you count towards Pentecost, you count, 7 Sabbaths, and so you have 50 days. 7 Sabbaths, and then that next Sunday, the 50th day, is the festival of first fruits, Chag HaBikurim, or Chag HaShavuot, the first festival of weeks, or the 50th day, which in Greek, the 50th day, or Pentecost. And here, you bring first fruits of the wheat harvest, and when you read about them, in verse 20, the priest shall wave them. So they were also waved. Are you with me? Leviticus 23:20. The priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits. In other words, other things that you can read about before. But I'm talking about the first fruits of the wheat harvest. Other things were included. The priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits as a wave offering before the Eternal with the 2 lambs. They shall be holy to the Eternal for the priest. So Jesus Christ is the first fruits of those resurrected. He's uniquely resurrected to immortal life during the days of unleavened bread, and that's when the wave sheaf should be brought, during the days of unleavened bread. So this year would have been brought on Sunday, the first day of this festival. I could also illustrate other things to develop that further, but I'll leave it at that for now. And then we have the first fruits of the wheat harvest, which pictures the church, which began on Pentecost. And it's also waved because that is the future of the church to be resurrected. So Jesus Christ is resurrected, and then the church, the saints are resurrected. And, some will have already been dead when Christ returns, and others will be living at that time and will immediately die and be resurrected. There's also an Old Covenant church and a New Covenant church, too. So there'll be some Old Covenant. We know some Old Covenant personalities will be resurrected. And I want to go to 1 Corinthians 15 on that. 1 Corinthians 15, and that will help illustrate this type, antitype. Verse 3, Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, and he says, "For I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12, and that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then last of all he was seen by me also," talking about the Apostle Paul, about himself, "as one born out of due time." But the point I want to make is that he did appear to a large number, and that possibly was on this day, 7th day of unleavened bread, at that time. Very possibly is when he appeared to that 500 number there or more. So that helps to tie in these special offerings for this festival and then for the next one coming up, towards which we're counting. And in 1 Corinthians 15, we find Moses sings a song of triumph after the crossing of the Red Sea. And what's interesting about this song of triumph is that the way it reads in the Hebrew, it's a special poetic tense that is evidently related to the ancient language of Akkadian, which is similar to Old Testament Hebrew, but was spoken in Mesopotamia was very likely Abraham's first language, and that's possibly why it is structured this way. When you read it, it looks like this. Then Moses and the children of Israel sang this song. Actually, it's interesting that it's put in a singular. It's like Moses sang this song and then the children of Israel joined him, or they all sang as one, maybe together in unison. But anyway, also what's interesting about it is that it looks like it's saying, then Moses and the children of Israel will sing this song. You know, it's an unusual tense, and it's rare. But what's interesting is that the Jews took this as a hint that in the resurrection, this song will be sung, this song of triumph, that it points to a resurrection. And I believe John had that in mind in the 15th chapter of the book of Revelation. Here is Exodus 15, and then I go to Revelation 15, and then you have the resurrected saints singing a song of triumph. Verse 3, they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying. So, great and marvelous are your works, Lord God Almighty, just and true are your ways, O King of the saints. So it's interesting that we have the song of triumph of the resurrected saints, and as I said, reflecting this earlier song of triumph in Exodus 15, which Jews always thought of as hinting towards a resurrection. There's one other place where that tense comes up, and also I think that also points to the resurrection, and that's in 1 Kings, in the story of two harlots that came to Solomon, and to show his wisdom, and I think it should be in the 3rd chapter of 1 Kings, or maybe the beginning of the 4th chapter, where Solomon is, he prayed for wisdom, and then we see that indeed he was given wisdom. You know the famous decision that he made as these two women quarreled over whose child it was. But I want to go to the beginning of that passage. In verse 16, it says, now two women, this is 1 Kings 3:16, now two women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. And this is that same bizarre tense where it seems like they're saying two women will come before the king. But it's a prophecy as well, because ultimately two harlots are going to come before the king. And those two harlots, of course, are Israel and Judah. You can read about that in... I think it's in the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, where we have that imagery there, talking about Israel and Judah, of Aholah and Aholibah, but well, it's not. It may be in. It may be in the beginning of Hosea, but we have this prophecy of, comparing Israel, talking about two women, Aholah and Aholibah. But in any case, Israel through the Bible is unfortunately both Israel and Judah did unfortunately become harlots ultimately, and yet they're going to have to come before the king. And when they do, though, they will come before the king, and through Jesus Christ they will be forgiven and restored, and then the two nations will be reunited. So but I think that even this passage is in a sense, that sense prophetic. So the point I'm bringing out is that this day of unleavened bread, a day of the triumph of the crossing of the Red Sea, and a day of the fall of the walls of Jericho. During this week, this is the week in which Jesus Christ was resurrected and ascended to his Father. And perhaps this was the day that he appeared to the largest number of people, proving his resurrection to those, at least to those people, and then they of course could spread it around, that they actually saw him, they saw the resurrected Christ. So this is, in that sense, a week of triumph, and this seventh day of unleavened bread, it culminates that week of triumph. And we have a focus, in a sense, on the resurrection. As we count towards Pentecost, the first day beginning to count towards Pentecost is the day Jesus Christ ascended to his Father. As you see in 1 John 20, he first appears to Mary Magdalene, and then he says, don't cling to me because I have to ascend to my Father, and because he's the antitype of the Omer, the wave sheaf that was lifted up. So as they were lifting up the wave sheaf, he was ascending to his Father. And as I said, so we can, during this week, we can begin focusing on the reality of the doctrine of the resurrection, a very critically important doctrine in Christianity. This is the ultimate destiny of humankind, is resurrection, in most cases to judgment, and in some cases, for the first fruits of God's family, resurrection to immortal life. But ultimately, everybody who is not incorrigible will have that experience, the opportunity to be resurrected to immortal life and not to experience the second death. Those are the two choices, immortal life or death forever. Either to be or not to be. But to be, it's not just to be, it's to be immortal. It's to be a son or daughter of God and sharing eternity with God. So it's more than, it's a being that is wonderful beyond what we can imagine. And that is something that I think we can focus on as we finish this festival. And so as I conclude this talk, I want to go to 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 57, which ties in with what the scriptures I quoted earlier. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. So this is certainly a day to be speaking of victories. All the best to you and yours.